Remember at this point that we are talking about Thomas Jefferson and all those things that are going on at this time. Now, Jefferson is going to be the president during this era. And what happens is that Jefferson makes this statement that says that we should have a wall of separation of church and state. Who's ever heard of that phrase before, separation of church and state? Okay? Pretty much everybody, right? Whenever there's some law, especially here in Utah when we have such a religious base, where people are like, well, we have to have separation of church and state. Well, here's the thing. Number one, make sure you know it's Jefferson. Jefferson's the one who says this, and it's used oftentimes as a sourcing. And number two is that the really important thing here is there anything in the Constitution that says that you have to separate church and state? No. It is not official. So I would make sure to highlight it is not official. By the way, if you weren't here last class and don't have these notes, they're available over in the in the box if you don't want to have to write them down. So this is not an official thing, and yet we say these words all the time. So, for example, when you get inaugurated, okay, what do you put your hand on when you get inaugurated? The Bible. Have we ever had a president not put their hand on the Bible?
No.
No, we have not. There has been one president who put a journal on top of a Bible, but it still counts. Same reason why we've had one president that had 6 Bibles that he put his hands on. Okay? So, okay, listen. Okay, listen. Now, why they put it on the Bible is it's very religious basis and things like that. It's also symbolic. So, for example, Obama's Bible that he had, that was Lincoln's Bible. Okay? And then over here, Donald Trump's Bible, that was his family's Bible. So it's very traditional. Now, if we were to have somebody who is non-Protestant or non-Christian become the president, I think it'd be really interesting because we've never had somebody not do it before. But obviously, again, we say separation of church and state, and yet you're required to do this. Or, for example, your money. On our money, it says, in God we trust. And people say, well, what about First Amendment and atheism? And yet we have it on all of our bills. Now, one other thing that happens, too, with the God one is our Pledge of Allegiance. Now, every day, by state law, we say the Pledge of Allegiance in this school every day during second period. Right? Yes, because all your teachers are following the law of the state of Utah. Now, when you go to say that mandatory pledge every single day, okay, while they go to say that pledge, there's a section in there that says under God that was added in the 1940s. Are you required to say under God when you do that mandatory pledge? No, that was affirmed by a Supreme Court case decision about 15 years ago. So they can require you to say the pledge, but they cannot force you to say under God. There's also been recent cases regarding whether do you have to say the pledge at all if they say it. Legally, you do not have to anymore. You can opt out, but there's like a process and a form that you have to do to opt out of the pledge. But they cannot physically force you. So this actually happened last year in Florida. Is there was somebody that was sitting and chose to sit during the pledge in response to Colin Kaepernick's decision to kneel during the anthem. They sat and a substitute teacher went over and forced them to stand up, as in came over, grabbed them, and yanked them out of their chair so they would stand up during the pledge. Okay? Teachers can't do that. So if they do that to you, please go tell an adult. That's not your teacher. Okay? Because they cannot do that. And so again, we have this under God thing, and yet we have separation of church and state here in America. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that you have an endless supply of being allowed to have church in schools or wherever it could be. So this Supreme Court case, which if you're taking AP Gov, is one of the most important ones you'll learn about. It's on the AP Gov test all the time. So in Engel v. Vitale, which happened in the 1960s, several church leaders in New York wanted people to be able to say a prayer in their schools. So what they did is they came together, almost 22 different schools, and they created a non-denominational prayer. That means that it's a prayer that is religious, but is not to one religion. So you had a bunch of Protestants, Catholics, Muslims, Mormons, all these people came together and created this prayer. Well then, what is the one religion that does not include in the non-denominational prayer? Is atheists. And so several atheists sued, saying that violated their religion of non-religion, and they won. And so now you can't have this. Now, I have a bunch of athletes always say, but when I'm competing here at the school, we get together as like a soccer team and we say a prayer before the game. That is fine. What I can't say is I can't come in front of you and say, all right, today this is our minute of prayer here in A-Push. Go ahead and start praying, guys. I can't say that, okay? That would violate the law, all right? But you can do that on your own. I actually had an incident at my last school where we were all at an assembly, and it was like a student-led assembly, and we're sitting there, and there's like parents and everything like that. It's like an awards ceremony, and one of the people was like, and now we're going to say the prayer. And she handed off the microphone, and somebody said the prayer at the assembly. And oh my gosh, we all were like, lawsuit. So none of us were closing our eyes because we all thought we were going to get sued. But we did not get sued, thank goodness. But we were in violation of law had that happened. Although we could have said, it was student-led or whatever it could be. Whatever it is. Now, some states do bend the rules a little bit. So I have some friends that teach in Texas. And in Texas, which is a very much religious state, they have a moment of reflection. So they'll say, okay, today's moment of reflection, go ahead and reflect. And 90% of the kids are all praying. But they cannot say that because it would be in violation of this. Like the teachers pray, the kids pray, but they can't say that or else it would be in violation. Except some kids just sleep. So, you can do whatever you want to do. Okay? If you really want to reflect. Okay?
Do we have an hour of reflection?
No, we cannot have an hour of reflection. Although I do know I have been at schools in the past that have a 30-minute reflection period. But really just people sleep and then teachers go off and work. So it's not really reflection, it's just free time. Okay? Anyways, so from there, in terms of religion after the revolution, and we'll talk about this far more extensively later after the quiz, but the religion after the revolution, the first thing you need to know is church attendance drops. You're no longer associated with the Church of England, and so church attendance drops. We also have the rise of what's called deism, which is the idea that you don't belong to a religion. So it's the idea that there is a God, but he's like a figure. Right? There is a supreme being, but I'm not going to go to church because he's a distant figure. And that rises in America, and we'll talk about later the effect of that. Now, one thing I would star is this last bullet, which is the beginning of slave and black churches. So we do have the start of very much a community of African Americans coming together and having that religion. So from there, we have the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the Louisiana Purchase was again by Jefferson. Make sure you know Jefferson authorizes the Louisiana Purchase. Which is weird, because remember, what political party does Jefferson belong to? The Anti-Federalists or the Democratic Republicans. And the Democratic Republicans believe in small or large governments? Small. Is there anything in the Constitution that says you can go off and buy thousands of acres of land and expand? No. So this is like the most un-Jefferson thing. So if you want to put next to this, is this in the Constitution? This is literally the most unconstitutional thing. Jefferson, as a normal Jeffersonian, would hate this. And yet Jefferson does it. It's very odd. Okay? So anyway, so we have all this land. So America has all the land up until the end of the French Revolutionary or French Indian War. And it ends right here. What is right here that ends our border? The Mississippi River. Okay, so the Mississippi River is our border. New France is owned over here. New Spain eventually owns all this land as well. But we really want the Mississippi for what reason? Trade, right? More Mississippi River, it has more trade. So you need to know two major reasons for Lewis and Clark's expedition. First reason is going to be trade. More land, more trade. So again, number one of what you need is trade. And we want control in particular of that Mississippi River so that we can be able to gain more and more money. Now, we end up buying the Louisiana Purchase, so this is what it looks like. We buy it from France. You need to know why we bought it from France. Why did France even want to sell it? And that, do you know?
They needed money.
Well, good, so they need money. So the problem is the French Revolution tanked the economy of France. And they're about to go into the Napoleonic Wars, and they don't have any money. So they're going to sell it because also this is useless land, right? They're not gaining anything from it. There's no precious materials, and so they sell it off. Now, they sell it so cheap. In fact, it was 3 cents an acre. We only have one other that was even close to that, and that was when we bought Alaska for 4 cents an acre, okay? So anyways, we buy all this land for super cheap. Now, I want you to notice these numbers, though. We bought New Orleans at the bottom for $6 million for New Orleans. Then we pay only a little more than double of that to double the size of the United States. Why would we pay more money for New Orleans? Yeah. It's a port, which means you get more what? Trade, which makes more money. You guys see how it's all about money, right? We care a lot about money in America. So anyway, so we buy the Louisiana Purchase, and then we're going to go west. Now, this, by the way, this bottom part is the key concept. Basically, what it says is following the Louisiana Purchase, we expand, right? We want more and more control, and we want more and more land from it. Now, the other reason of why we went is we have two people that we are going to send on this trip. Who are the two people that we send on this trip? Lewis and Clark, okay? You guys have all learned this before, right? You've all taken, hopefully, first grade, okay? So what happens is that Lewis and Clark are sent. Now, Lewis is sent because he is Jefferson's private secretary, which means that he is going to be really good at writing things. Now, Clark gets sent, though, and Clark is an army officer. Why would they send an army officer west? What do you think that cause would be? What are they looking for in the west, possibly? They send the army officers. Anybody have an idea? Yeah, so it's basically military control over natives and possibly Spain. So as they go to move west, they send a military officer to see, can we conquer people? Can we get more and more land? You doing okay over there? Okay. All right. So anyway, so again, reason number 2 is military. We wanted to see what kind of military expansion we could have in the West. So they are going to leave on May 14th of 1804. If you want a really easy way to remember what day that they left, it is also Miss Ray's birthday. So if you're ever like, what day did they leave? Just remember Miss Ray, and then it will come into your head that it's on May 14th. I was not born in 1804. But the May 14th part was my birthday. But thanks for making me feel old. That makes me feel really good about myself. Okay. So anyways, so we begin to move west on May 14th. Now, the idea was to move west so far that you could be able to get across with waterways into the Pacific Ocean. But we can't do that because of what? Anybody know what it's called? It's the Rockies, which creates the continental divide. Okay? Continental divide means that we're so high right here that water only goes one way or the other, which prevents us from having a waterway that's all the way across the United States. But that's what they were looking for. Now, while they are on this trip, that they are going to need some help. And so they end up enlisting this guy who becomes their French interpreter. Well, the thing is that he has a wife, which is Sacagawea. Now, she is a Native American, but it is a huge deal that he has her. And the reason why is because she is fluent in 15 native languages. Okay? What does that mean? You can now have somebody that speaks the language. And if there's tension, she can diffuse it. Now, she was pretty cool. She actually ended up having a baby shortly before this trip that she actually carried. So for those of you who walk a mile and you're like, wow, I'm so tired, imagine walking hundreds of miles with a baby on your back. Okay? Now, she was very important because she also realized how important this trip was. So for example, there's a story where they were all in a canoe going down the river. The canoe tipped and everybody went out and all of them attempted to survive and swim to shore. However, Sacagawea went and collected all their belongings, brought it to the shore, and saved all their research. Okay? So she was a really important factor into why this was so important. Now, one of the things that they were doing, though, is they were also looking for science. They wanted to see, so if you want to put reason number 3, is scientific discovery. They wanted to be able to discover new things. Now, in the West Coast, we have very different animals, okay, especially here in Utah and in Idaho. Now, I'm a hunter, and one of the things you have to do to be able to hunt is you have to take hunter safety courses, okay? So I went and did a hunter safety course to get my license for the first time, and one of the tests that they do is they have a bunch of pictures. And they'll hold up a picture of a moose, and they'll say, what animal is this? And you have to write it down, okay? Or they'll hold up a picture of an elk, and you have to write it down what it is, okay? Well, I had 3 people from Hawaii in my group, and they held up a picture of a moose, and they were raised their hand, I don't know what that is, okay? They held up a picture of a duck. They're like, I don't know what that is, okay? Why didn't they know what it was? They don't have those animals in Hawaii, right? They don't have a bunch of zoos that have moose everywhere, okay? And so what happened is that they were really interested in this ecology of the West. Now, this is where Meriwether Lewis came in. His job was to collect all the scientific evidence and write it down. So when he comes in contact with a new animal, he has to be very descriptive in what he sees. So I'm going to show you on the board one of these animals. By the text, you have to figure out what is it. So if you know it, Don't raise your hand just yet. Okay? So, let's see if you can figure out what this means. Discovered a village of small animals that burrow in the ground. Killed one and caught one alive by pouring a great quantity of water in his hole. We attempted to dig to the beds of one of those animals. After digging 6 feet, found by running a pole down that we were not halfway to his lodge. The village of those animals covered about 4 acres of ground on a gradual descent of a hill. It contains great numbers of holes in the top, of which those little animals set erect, making a whistling noise. If you know what it is, raise your hand. We have some guesses. Okay, what is it? It is it's the western version of the groundhog.
Prairie dog.
It's a prairie dog. Okay, so it's a smaller version of a groundhog. Okay, so it is a prairie dog, which I'm from Idaho, and we actually call these whistle pigs. So it was weird to come to Utah and have it be like a nice name. But that's what he was describing. And by the way, that excerpt is actually part of a 7-page essay about his description. So imagine having to write that, and that's really why Jefferson chose him, is as a secretary. Now, one thing about these animals, though, is he also wanted the animals themselves. So every time they came into contact with a new animal, the party killed that animal. Then they stuffed it and sent it back to Jefferson. So if you've been to Monticello, they actually have rooms that are like this, is that he basically took 3 rooms of the White House and filled it with hundreds of animal carcasses that were stuffed. And he loved looking at them. And in Monticello, they've moved in there now, because he wanted to discover all these different animals. Now, the last thing I would say is if you ever see the word core discovery, that core discovery is a term that you might see as a sourcing, and that means Lewis and Clark. Okay? Which brings us to the War of 1812, which is the most important thing that we're going to learn today. Now, with the War of 1812, it has been an essay in the past. 2 years ago, it was the DBQ for the international exam. It can be an essay. So what I would make sure to put next to the War of 1812 is what I would memorize for it are the causes, the effects, and the events that happened during the war. Okay? So, with the War of 1812, okay? Now, this war is going to come out of disagreements between America and England. So we're going to start with the causes of the war. And one of the first causes that makes Americans really bad is impressment. Who has ever heard of impressment before? Yeah, everybody should raise their hand. And if you're not, I am concerned. Okay? Because we talked about this a ton. Not the War of 1812, but what conflict was caused by impressment that we talked about in this class? The Revolution, right? That was a huge cause. So why is it a cause then of the War of 1812 if we have been free for over 30 years? Well, while we were free, England never took away that law. So we weren't a part of them, but England still had a law that said that they could take American soldiers and force them into their navy. So imagine if Donald Trump made a law that said we could go over to Japan and take as many people as we want for our army. Right? That wouldn't make any sense. So what happens is Americans are continually being stopped by the British. Well, what results in this is a major conflict. You see, this ship right here, the Leopard, that is from England. They're one of the biggest Navy ships. They find the USS Chesapeake in American waters. They go up to that ship and they enter it and they say, you have now been commandeered and you are now part of the British Navy. They respond and they say, wait a second, we're Americans. We're our own nation. And they decide to fight. Within 1 hour, over 250 people are killed on the USS Chesapeake. So now impressment is not just taking people, it's killing people. So on your notes, I would put down that impressment is the American reason why we entered the war. This is what made Americans mad. Now, in response, America decides that they are going to stop this impressment by convincing England to stop impressing Americans. So we pass a law that is known as the Embargo Act, and this is a starred term, very important. Now, the Embargo Act is an attempt to use economic warfare. Make sure you know economic warfare when you see embargoes. We are attempting to convince somebody to stop what they're doing through economics. For example, there is one country in the world that we have had a constant embargo on for the last 40 years. Anybody know what country that is? Not China.
Russia.
It was Cuba, but we stopped with Cuba. North Korea. Good job, everybody. North Korea. So, North Korea, we have an embargo on. Now, we have done some embargoes with China, but it's not a constant embargo. An embargo means that we limit trade with them. So what an embargo means is that we basically stop all trade, which is why North Korea can only trade with China, because China's the only one that doesn't have an embargo on them. Okay? Now, economic warfare is extremely effective. Let me give you a modern day example that's affecting people right now. Okay? So over in the Middle East, Turkey and Syria have been at constant warfare from each other for hundreds of years. They hate each other. Well, recently, Syria is not happy with Turkey, but Turkey is an American ally. And we currently have troops in Turkey. So Syria told the United States, you need to pull your troops from Turkey in case we want to invade. In order to convince us, they raised oil prices. Did you guys notice about 2 weeks ago that oil prices all of a sudden rose about 30 cents a gallon? Overnight? And people are like, why is it raising when it's supposed to be winter and it's supposed to go down? It's because Syria raised their prices. 5 days ago, Donald Trump took all of our troops out of Turkey. This morning, as of like 9 a.m., Turkey has now begun to bomb Syria and they are likely to go to war. Okay? So economic warfare is extremely effective and we have now pulled our troops from Turkey. Okay? So when we talk about embargoes, that's a huge thing. So America puts an embargo on England. Now there are two words that I want you to put next to the word embargo that will help trigger your memory in case you see this on the AP exam. The first one is turtle. Turtle. The animal. Turtle. If you need me to help spell it, I can. Now, you can see that turtle that we're talking about that's up on the board. It has something like, there's a tortoise. It's actually not. It is a turtle. It's a snapping turtle. Okay? Now, the reason why is because our major ports in America has a whole bunch of snapping turtles in it. So at this time, snapping turtles become a symbol in political cartoons of this embargo. If you will also put next to the word turtle, the word ogrambe. You can spell it as oh grab me, but it is also on the board. Oh grab me. It's also pronounced ogrambe. If you see either a turtle or the word ogrambe, you need to know it's a War of 1812. And I'll teach you a trick of how to remember it. Okay? So, the turtle represents the embargo. The turtle represents the embargo. Okay? It is snapping at the British who are attempting to get more trade. Now, if you notice their text boxes up here, though, first off, I like that they still censor back in the 1800s. Okay? And it says, oh, this cursed ogrambe. What is ogrambe spelled backwards? Embargo. Okay? So what it is it's a trick into convincing you and showing you that they're upset about the Embargo Act, or they're showing something about the Embargo Act. So anytime that you see that, that's what it's referring to. So we stopped trade with England by creating what is known as the Non-Intercourse Act. If you will go ahead and do an arrow from Embargo Act to Non-Intercourse Act. The reason why is because the Non-Intercourse Act basically means that we are banning all ships to two countries, Britain and France. And you might say, well, why France? That's because France had allied with Britain, so we cut off trade to both of them. And yes. And the effect of that is that world trade plummets. Okay? We go from making almost $140 million in trade to $20 million in the space of 2 months. Okay? World trade plummets. Well, what happens is that, again, Embargo Act, that is England's reason for entering the war. They need the trade back. So America's reason for entering is impressment. England's reason is for embargo and trade. Okay? Now, one other one that I want to show you. So this is another example. Do you guys see the turtle? That's how you automatically know it's a War of 1812. Okay? By the way, the turtle, if you want to use the fancy word, which I'm sure none of you will remember, is actually terrapin. And that's the actual formal name for the animal. It's called a terrapin turtle. We actually don't have terrapins anymore. They are extinct because in the late 1800s they used them for their shells. However, the University of Maryland, their mascot is the terrapin, snapping turtle. Okay? Now, I want you to write next to War of 1812, James Madison. You're not going to see much about James Madison on the AP exam unless it's Marbury v. Madison, or it's the War of 1812. Okay? Now, why did Native Americans get involved in all this? Well, what happens is that Native American tribes in the north begin to speak through the Great Spirit. And the Great Spirit, who's basically the head god, begins to tell them that they need to get rid of everybody who is white in the Americas, that the white man has come and they have ruined things for the Native Americans. Well, what happens is that in Provincetown, Illinois, Tecumseh, who's the leader of the tribe here, is going to end up rebelling against the Americans. And they begin a fight known as the Tecumseh War in the north. Well, what happens is that the natives ally with the British. So if you see this right here, this is them scalping American soldiers and giving it to the British. It actually says Humane British up here, and if you notice it says Best Friends Forever. Okay, that's because they wanted to give all of that to the British. Now, in the end, William Henry Harrison ends this war at a battle known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. Now, William Henry Harrison wins this war. The natives are destroyed. And he becomes more famous, though, because he becomes our next president. Okay? So he becomes our next president. However, he becomes the president, and he's so proud to become the president that he decides to give an inaugural address. And in that inaugural address, he decides to make it really long. And in the middle of January, without a coat, he gives a 8,445-word essay that's about 30 pages long, and it takes 2 hours for him to read it. Okay? 1 month later, he dies of pneumonia. Okay? Now, the reality is that it's always been this joke and this running gag that this long inaugural address causes death. There has been controversy that now say that he had other disorders that led to it, but it's much more fun to say that he died of pneumonia from a long speech. Now, interestingly enough, if you go Google, like, best presidents ranked, he's actually, like, middle of the list. And because he was only there for a month, so he couldn't screw stuff up. So, he's actually, pretty high up there because of that. Okay, so anyway, so we begin to move into the war. So, the only other thing I would say is make sure you know why the British were involved, why the Americans, why the natives, because, again, previous issues, well, they wanted to ally with Britain, who liked the proclamation line. And America's biggest thing is, if you will highlight, they wanted to become a worldwide power. They didn't want to just be that old country. They wanted to be themselves. And they want to do this in two ways. If you'll do number one, is to gain more territory. And number two is to increase world trade. Okay? So, you need to know who would have supported this action. Who would have brought this into the war? So these are the war hawks. Okay? Make sure you star the term war hawks. And you need to know who was a war hawk and who disagreed with the war. Now, the war hawks are going to be supported by the Democratic Republicans. If you'll go ahead and star that second bullet. Now, here's the weird part, though. Democratic Republicans, are they big or small government?
Small.
Small. Do you guys remember what Jefferson did with the military? He cut it. And yet, what are we doing now? We're going to war. So the Democratic Republicans, Torliff, you nudge him. We were just talking about war hawks, and I thought you might want to know about it.
I'm listening.
Okay, great. So the Democratic Republicans, who just barely cut the army, are now going to support it. And the reason why is, if you will make sure to highlight, is westward expansion and American expansion. They believe that they wanted more and more land, which ended up leading to them wanting to support this war. Okay? Now, you also need to know, why did the Federalists disagree with this? So the Federalists hated this because, if you will highlight, it was economically idiotic to fight in this war. Remember, the majority of the Federalists are what two professions? Merchants and bankers. Okay? Would an embargo be good for them? No, they would lose all their money. So it's economically idiotic. So a Federalist with today's stuff would say we should not go to war with Turkey or Syria because it would be economically idiotic because our gas prices would rise. Okay? That is what that would end up meaning. So we end up going to war, and we have several different skirmishes. If you notice from this map, the vast majority of these skirmishes are going to be in the north. That's because at this point, Canada is owned by England. And we think, you know what? We're going to go for it all. We want Canada. So we get 1,000 of our men, mostly from the south and in Kentucky, and we bring them up to the northern border, and we're going to invade Canada, and we're going to make it America, and it's going to be great. Well, what?
Only 1,000 people.
Yeah, well, we thought the Canadians are not very good, though, so we would just go in and defeat them. It was no biggie. So we show up with all of our men, and we enter into Canada, and we're met by 20,000 British soldiers, and we surrender within 15 minutes. So our idea of invading Canada was a total fail. And in response, they end up coming back to us, and they invade into America. They begin by doing several naval battles, but they want the glory, so they're going to go to Washington, D.C., and they're going to burn it to the ground. Okay? Now, what else is in Washington, D.C. that might be important at this point? Is the White House. So they're going to set fire to the original White House. Now, when they set fire to it, a lot of this had to do with destroying like that American icon back then and destroying the house of the president. Now, at this time, James Madison is not at the White House. He is actually somewhere else. However, his wife, Dolly Madison, is. And she realizes that there are important relics in the White House that they need to preserve. And so she runs into the flames and saves a painting of George Washington. Now, this is the painting that it is. It is unfinished, and that's because it was unfinished when it was saved. But she saves this painting along with the accompanying painting of his wife, Martha Washington. And this painting becomes extremely famous because she preserved the legacy of George Washington. Now, these two paintings, by the way, are not on display. They are taken off. They're only brought out in certain circumstances because they are so rare. However, in memory of these paintings, we took our dollar bill and we put the painting on it. So that's basically what happened, is that we wanted to be able to preserve that memory. Now, I have taught you a whole bunch of stuff about this battle, but there's nothing better than a great song. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to a song all about the War of 1812. Now, one thing about this song is it is made by Canadians who are extremely proud that they burnt the White House down in the Battle of Washington, okay? So if this song you consider offended because it is anti-American, I'm sorry, but it's pretty funny. Now, by the way, as we go to watch this, you might notice a whole bunch of references, and you're like, Miss Ray, I don't understand the reference. That's because you're not Canadian, okay? So it's nice to learn new things. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and watch this. And it's also extremely catchy. Very catchy song.
Thank you so much.
Oh, come back, proud Canadians, to before you had TV. No hockey night in Canada. There was no CBC. God! In 1812, Madison was mad. He was the president, you know. Well, he thought he'd tell the British where they ought to go. He thought he'd invade Canada. He thought that he was tough. Instead, we went to Washington and burned down all his stuff in the White House. Burn, 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 and we're the ones that did it. It burned, 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 while the president ran and cried. It burned, 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 and things were very historical. And the Americans ran and cried like a bunch of little babies. Wah, 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 in the War of 1812.
Now hillbillies from Kentucky, dressed in green and red, left home to fight in Canada, but they returned home dead. It's the only war the Yankees lost except for Vietnam.
And also the Alamo right after the Bay of Ham.
The loser was America, the winner was ourselves.
So join right in and blow them up. The War of 1812 in the White House burned, 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 and we're the ones that did it. It burned, 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 while the president ran and cried. It burned, 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 and things were very historical. And the Americans ran and cried like a bunch of little babies. Wah, 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 in the War of 1812.
In 1812, we were just sitting around, minding our own business, putting crops into the ground.
ground. We heard the soldiers coming and we didn't like that sound.
So we took a boat to Washington and burned it to the ground.
Oh, we fired our guns, but the Yankees kept a-coming. There wasn't quite as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and the Yankees started running. Down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Oh, oh.
Okay, and we're going to stop there, but you can go listen to the rest of the song some other time. So as you can see, there are many very proud Canadians about the fact that they destroyed America in the War of 1812. But there is one positive pro-American thing that does come from this event. So right outside of Washington is a place called Fort McHenry. And after about a week after they burned Washington to the ground, all the troops were solidified and went to this fort. And then over the next 3 days is a massive naval fight between the British and the Americans. Now, there's this random dude who is in one of these ships in the harbor when all of a sudden the war goes off. And he goes up onto the decks and he sees this huge battle that is going on. And that is this guy. Who is this guy? Francis Scott Key. And what did he create? The Star-Spangled Banner. And he creates this because he sees this beautiful flag flying in the wind as we win the battle. Now, the original Star-Spangled Banner was actually not that flag. Okay, the actual flag that fought in the battle was about the size of this flag, and that's very traditional. One, because if it gets destroyed, they can easily put it back up, and two, it's less likely to be destroyed by bombs and different things like that. So after the war was over, they re-put up a new flag that looks like this, and this flag is massive. Okay, it's one of those flags like the one that you drive along I-15 and you see along the side of the road. Now, this is the original Star-Spangled Banner. Now, the Star-Spangled Banner, if you notice, is actually not complete anymore. So if you see right here, there's a huge gap that's missing right here. There's a gap missing right here. There's a bunch of gaps over here. It's because the original family that owned it wanted to memorialize the veterans. So if a veteran from that battle came over, they would actually cut out a piece of the flag and hand it to them. And so there's a bunch of pieces missing from the flag itself. Has anybody been to the Star-Spangled Banner at the Smithsonian? Okay, a bunch of people, good. So, if you go, it is almost pitch black. And the reason why is because the original flag, up until 2005-ish, was actually up on the wall of the Smithsonian. It was like in a glass case, and you could see it. But they would literally watch, and the strings would come apart on it, and parts would fall while people were there at the Smithsonian. So they spent 4 years creating this brand new thing, and it's completely temperature controlled, it's UV protected, and things like that. Don't be what Miss Ray was, because I clearly, when I walked through, because I saw it in November, did not see the sign that said, "Photography ruins the flag, don't take pictures." And I took a picture of it. So don't do that. Don't be Miss Ray. But this is what the flag looks like if you want to be able to go and visit it. Now, after this battle, America switches and begins to go down into the Creek War, which is against the Native Americans. Make sure that you know about the Creek War and that it was with the Native Americans. Now, the Creek War is going to be fought with the Native Americans down in the South. And this guy named Andrew Jackson, which within the next couple of weeks you'll probably hate him, Andrew Jackson is the major general in this battle and basically decimates the Native tribes. Now, in the end, America wins pretty easily against the Native tribes, but the big impact this has on the Natives is that this is also, if you'll make sure to write down, the first real restriction against the Natives. So it's not a reservation, because we don't have reservations at this time, but they basically put them into a very small area, which is what you can see right here, and they heavily restrict them and they lose their land. All this land that was in the stripes, that's all their former land. So that's really the big impact from there. So we talked about all this stuff right here, so let's go ahead and let's get towards the end. Now, in the end, both sides realized it was economically beneficial to end the war. We needed to resume trade. We haven't really thought about anything. It's been 2 years. Let's just go ahead and end this war. So they send a bunch of Democratic Republicans over, and they are going to... Sorry, I think it's snowing outside. It's begun. It's winter. Okay. Anyways, sorry. Okay, calm back. I'm sorry. I get distracted by snow. Okay. Anyways... So they send a whole bunch of these guys over into Belgium, and they are going to sign what's known as the Treaty of Ghent. Make sure that you know the Ghent word, Treaty of Ghent. Make sure you know that, because if you see that, you need to automatically say War of 1812. Okay? Now, the Treaty of Ghent actually didn't do that much. It ended the war, but neither side really got anything. The only thing that we did get is there was disputed territory in Maine, and so we got Maine and finished New England. But there was really no major gains. But the major reason why we signed that agreement, if you will do an arrow from Hartford Convention and put it up into Treaty of Ghent, right before the Hartford Convention, a bunch of Federalists got together and said, if you don't end this war, we are going to secede and create our own government. So what happened is that they wanted to leave in an attempt to be able to get that finished. Okay? Which brings us to our fun stuff that we're going to learn about. You don't need anything else for the rest of class. Put your notes away. You don't need your computer. All you need is your adorable little mind to learn. Yeah. Go ahead, quickly put your notes away, because the quicker you are, the more stuff we get to learn. All right, Kane. So, I am so excited to teach you about this stuff. You guys remember how I said I'm going to teach you something super morbid and you're never going to forget it?
Yeah.
Today's that day. Okay? So, couple things really quick. Number one, is this ever going to be asked about in the AP exam? No. Could you use it in an essay? Yes. Same reason why people last year did Molly Pitcher. Okay? So, the whole point I'm trying to show you with this too, though, there's more to history than just what's on the APUSH exam. Okay? Now, as a teacher, there are these companies that pay you to travel and learn about stuff so you can become a better teacher. So, and I didn't do it last summer because I had a kid and he kind of ruined it, but I'm sure next summer I'll go back to doing it. So 5 years ago, I went to New Orleans for one of these fellowships, and I was learning there. The National World War II Museum is there, but we're not going to learn about World War II. We're going to learn about random stuff I learned about New Orleans. Now, this is what is known about, so by the way, one quick thing as we go to this little virtual field trip, is that this is Miss Ray's photos, and this was before I got my much nicer DSLR camera. So if you're like, I had somebody yesterday be like, these photo quality is bad. Okay, sorry, all right? Took these pictures myself. Don't be a Debbie Downer, okay? So, first off, this is what's known as Jackson Square, which is probably the most famous thing in all of New Orleans. It's where all the major things happen. Now, who do you think the statue is in Jackson Square? It's Andrew Jackson. Good job. So, Andrew Jackson has this statue. So, it's a bronze statue of Andrew Jackson. Now, this statue is very interesting, and we'll learn about later about why they even have a statue of Jackson in New Orleans. But the statue itself is interesting because he's actually pulling out a sword. And when they originally created the statue, they were like, we got a great idea. Let's make a bronze statue of him pulling a sword out, and we'll make it the real sword. So they did the entire thing out of bronze, and then took his real sword, put it into the sheath, and then molded the bronze around it so it would look really cool. Right? And it was his real sword. That worked for 10 days until somebody stole the sword. Okay? And they've never found the sword. They don't know where it went. They did a bunch of replacement swords, but eventually after 15, they had been stolen so much, they just abandoned it. So if you ever go to look at him, he's going like this, but there's no sword in the sheath. Okay? So that's kind of an interesting thing about it. Now, they did. They don't know how somebody took it. And this was in the 1800s, too. So they have no idea what happened. Anyways, so New Orleans itself, though, is a very interesting look. So this is what a house looks like in New Orleans. And if you notice, there's only a few feet in between the street and New Orleans homes. Now you might say, well, why would they do that, right? That's kind of weird. It is because of one house and one house alone, and that is this house right here. In fact, this lady is so grumpy, okay, because this house ruined it for everybody. So what happens is that this house has a farmer that lives in it, and he has a cow that is calving, which means that they are having a baby. It's very traditional for families when their cows are having babies to bring them into the house to keep them warm and keep the calf alive. So they bring in the calf and the family falls asleep. Overnight, the cow gets angry and knocks over a kerosene lamp. It then lights the entire house on fire. Now the problem? It was pretty deep set, so firefighters couldn't get to it. and then all the houses next to it caught on fire, and the result is the entire city of New Orleans burnt to the ground. Okay? Now, this happened 3 times in the space of 10 years, where they would rebuild, all the houses would be pushed back off the street, and it would burn down again. So what they decided to do is they made a new law. So the law in New Orleans is that your house in the main New Orleans must be within 8 feet of the street. Okay? If you choose to offset your house, which as you can see right here, this house is pushed back, the fire department does not have to legally help you in a fire. And the reason why is because you've done it to yourself. So what they do is that in this fire situation, they will save the houses around you, but you have to go get your own private firefighters, which you can pay a firefighter tax. You have to pay a fee if you do it offset, and they have to fight the fire, okay? Because of the way that the streets are designed. No. We talked about that. So at this time, we talked about how violent it is. There's a lot of death in New Orleans. So what we're going to talk about is how do they bury their dead in New Orleans. Now, they bury them in these cemeteries, and last year I had,
How would having the houses closer to the street help it?
Because at this time, the way that the fire departments work is there's not some cool fire hydrant that you plug into. You have to cart water there, and then they ended up creating like a hose system to get the water. So the farther you are from the street, you don't have as much pressure to get the water there. And so it's just going to take longer to do. And so this law, which has been around since the 1800s, now if you get into a fire, will they help you? Yes, but legally they don't have to. Okay, so back in the olden days, they just let them burn. Yeah. Did you have a question? Okay. So anyways, I did have somebody last year say they really liked this presentation and they were going to New Orleans in December. I gave them all the information. So if you really like what you're learning, I can tell you how you can go and learn about this stuff too. It's like a really simple tour. But they have to figure out how to bury their dead. Now, the problem is that in New Orleans, they need to bury their dead in some way. Now, the majority of New Orleans is Catholic. And in the Catholic religion, you have to be buried in the ground or else you don't get an afterlife. That's a very traditional Catholic thing to do. Well, the thing is that New Orleans has a problem. It's called science. You see, there's this thing called the water table. Every single place in the world has it. The water table is where the water sits. Now, here in Utah, our water table is very deep. That's why we're able to create basements and things like that. But in New Orleans, it is only 5 feet under the ground. That's because they are below sea level. How many feet do you have to bury a person? 6. So what they did in the early 1800s is they would bury somebody in the ground, say their goodbyes, walk away, and 5 days later, the coffin would come out of the ground because it would float up because of the water table. So they're like, oh, but no worries. We can solve science. And so they would take these coffins, put you in it, you would say your goodbyes, then they would fill it up with cement, and then put you in the ground. And then the weight would keep you down. 5 days later, you'd pop right back up. Okay? So they have a problem, and they need to bury you in the ground, but how are they going to have a solution? Well, New Orleans is smart. You see, they have hurricanes. And because they have hurricanes, they create a system which are called levees. And levees are giant mounds of dirt that prevent the hurricanes from allowing the water to come into the city. And this works great because what else is this? A great place to bury people. So what they would do is they create these levees, and they would take bodies and put them in coffins, and they would bury them into the levee. That worked great for about 30 years. And then a Category 5 hurricane showed up. Okay? And destroyed the levees. And then people would open the door, and they'd be like, oh, look, there's Uncle Jimmy from 10 years ago. Because all the bodies started floating down the Mississippi River. And so all these dead bodies, we're talking thousands of dead bodies, are all around the city in various stages of decomposition. And they have to now determine how can we solve this problem. So the first solution that they come up with is, by the way, one other thing about death and why death was such popular is that there was a whole bunch of death at this time also because of yellow fever. There was a yellow fever outbreak in New Orleans. It killed about 1/3 of the people in New Orleans. And so they didn't have germ theory back then. All they knew is they had a bunch of dead bodies. So many dead bodies that they were having several funerals a day. So what would happen is when you died, if you had yellow fever, they brought you to the church. But there were so many people that had died that they filled up the church with bodies, and they would have a mass funeral. All the people would stand outside. They would have the funeral, immediately bring them into the backyard, and end up burying them. They didn't know germ theory back then, though. So they didn't realize, why are so many priests dying? Why are so many cemetery workers dying of yellow fever? They didn't realize that you could catch it from touching with those bodies. So they need a place to bury these people. So the first thing is what's called a coping tomb. A coping tomb is a way to bury somebody without putting them into the ground. So what they would do is, this is all quartz, by the way, so this is very expensive, about $30,000 to create. And they would build a wall made of quartz, put dirt in it, and then put you in it. So technically, you are buried in the ground, but it's above the water table. The problem is, this is really, really expensive for every single person to do. People can't afford $30,000 to be able to bury somebody. Now, they also had mass graves of this too. So this is a mass coping tomb. So this actually has about 20 bodies in it. It's about the length of this room if you split it in half. So this also, if you notice, says Home for the Incurables. This is an insane asylum. So if you were put into an insane asylum, which also could be like if you had Down syndrome, autism, those people go too, because at this time they get abandoned by their families. And if you died, you were buried in this mass grave, and then over here your first name gets put on there. You don't have a last name because you've been disowned. But the problem is, this is really expensive. So they come up with this new idea. This is what we're going to talk about today. This is where it starts to get very cool. You see, your family buys one of these vaults. And your family, which one of these vaults is about $30,000, $40,000 to be able to buy one of these vaults. But your entire family gets to be in there because every one of these squares holds 100 bodies in it. You might say, well, wait a second. That doesn't make sense. That vault is only 8 feet deep and 3 feet tall. How does it fit 100 bodies in there? Well, then you can also upgrade and get a larger one if you have a larger family. One of these vaults holds 150 bodies in it. And then one of these vaults right here, which is about 8 feet tall, 3 feet wide, holds over 200 bodies. You might say, wait a second, Miss Ray, math doesn't work like that. Okay? Well, let's talk about how this works. Okay? And this is where it gets very exciting and very gross at the same time. You see, back in the 1800s, they figured out a way to get rid of a bunch of bodies, bury them into the ground, and still keep families together. So your family purchases a vault. So let's pretend I buy this vault. Now this vault will typically be, and this is one of the more rare vaults, as in like it's farther away. St. Louis Cemetery number 1 is the most expensive. This is number 2. These vaults are about $150,000, $200,000 a piece. The other cemetery, which is the more famous cemetery, is about $300,000. So your family pools their money together. So your entire extended family, and you typically buy the vault and you make payment plans every single month. Okay? Now let's say that you die. They take your body and they put you into one of these slots. There's 2 slots, 2 body slots in this place. They put your body in without a coffin. They then take bricks and they end up putting all the bricks together. And then they cover it with cement and they put the date that you died on it as well as your name. Now there's a mourning period in New Orleans that's 365 days. So if your body is in there and somebody else dies in your family, they go in the bottom slot. But if somebody else dies and you're still waiting for these 2 slots to open up, you can actually rent one of these wall vaults. And there's like a rental period that they put your body in. And then once the 365 days are up, they move your body into the bigger vault. Okay? But again, how can they move your body in when there's no space? Well, here's what happens. They put your body into this and they make it all closed up. It gets so hot and humid in there that on hot days, it can reach up to 1,000 degrees. Okay? Now, it gets so hot that your body begins to disintegrate. And within 2 to 3 months, it is so hot and humid, you literally become dust. Okay? So when they need a new body in there, they open it up. They take a broom, they push it to the back, there's a little slot, it falls down, it goes into this bottom part, and you are technically buried in the ground because it is now underground, and they put the new body in. And they repeat this process over and over and over again until the entire bottom is filled. Once it reaches ground level, you now have to buy a new vault. Yes?
If there's 3 people dead, you only have 2 slots.
Then one goes into the rental wall vault.
Would it turn into dust?
Yes. So it turns into dust, and then they just like collect it in like a little dustpan, and they transfer you over to the other vault. Okay? Now, don't worry, guys. We are much more professional than it used to be. It used to be that all the dust just hung out down here. So if you open up one of the vaults, so the reason that this one is open is because this family bought the vault, and then everybody died before it was finished, and they couldn't put their bodies in, so they were buried elsewhere. So that's why this one is open. But let's pretend that, for example, your whole family's in there, all your dust particles are just like mushed together down here, okay? So there's no order. Well, now that we have DNA and we might care about our DNA a little bit more and whose dust is whose, they do it a little bit more professionally, and I actually saw this, and I swear it was the coolest but grossest thing ever. So instead of just putting everybody into the back now, they put you into a Ziploc baggie. So last time I was there, they had 2 bodies that they were doing DNA testing for like some sort of hereditary disease or something like that. And I literally see these guys from the mortuary, and they're like putting people into a dustpan, and then like somebody's holding up the Ziploc, and they're like pouring it in, and they put your name on it. And then what they do is after that's on, they put it down into the bottom. And so this place that I had seen just had all these Ziploc baggies down at the bottom of everybody's remains in it. Okay? Now, that brings us to the next part, which is all about voodoo. Yeah. Hunt.
Knocks down all the graves and just in Ziploc bags.
I mean, in theory, yes, but the way that these work is that this goes down 5 feet. So in theory, so like a Hurricane Katrina comes along, if they have sealed this correctly, it's not going to go into the tomb at all.
Okay.
So when Hurricane Katrina happened, all of the cemeteries, so this is an interesting fact about Hurricane Katrina. You've probably seen images of Katrina where the entire city was underwater and people almost died. That was not this area. The French Quarter was actually not destroyed hardly at all, and they attempted to reopen the next day, and they were prevented by the government. It was the poor areas that end up having that. Well, poor people can't afford this, so they're not going to be here. So St. Louis Cemetery number 1 hardly had any damage. Now this is number 2, which is in the Garden District, a little bit further away, but that's where all the rich people again live, and so it was hardly destroyed at all. But in theory, if a hurricane were to come, if it's sealed correctly, they're not going to receive any damage. But we'll see. So if you are like watching and there's a hurricane, you're like, oh look, little baggies. Now you know. Okay? They're little human bodies. So let's talk about voodoo. Now, traditional voodoo is a very respectable African religion. If you guys have ever heard of voodoo dolls actually heal people. So if you're trying to like hurt somebody, you're actually healing them by practicing voodoo. Okay? Now on the left, this is the voodoo queen. She was the person who really made voodoo in America a thing. So she was a former slave that came over. She was very prominent in the community. So in this tomb, what happens is that people come and actually worship at this tomb. So here's how it works. You go up to her tomb, you knock 3 times, you kiss your fingers, which you then kiss onto the tomb, and you leave an artifact that you have been wearing. Oftentimes it's women, so you have like a hair tie, a bobby pin, a ring, and so all on the bottom here are like all the random little things that people have left. And the idea is that according to legend, within 1 year, you will find your soulmate and get married. That's the goal of this, okay? So what is this tomb over here? Well, this tomb is her daughter's. You see, what happened is her daughter, which she had taught voodoo to, her daughter was a bit more promiscuous than her mother. And in fact, her daughter was so promiscuous that she had an affair with the governor, who was white and she was black, and he had a wife. And they had a relationship for 15 years. Well, in the end, in the late 1800s, she ends up asking her little boy toy, okay? She ends up asking him, leave your wife. Well, number 1, he's white, he's the governor, and he's married. So he ends up responding, he says no. Oddly enough, about a month later, he's sitting at the dinner table. He begins to eat, and all of a sudden he begins to convulse and he dies. Now, the rumor goes that the voodoo queen ended up being so mad that she created her own section of voodoo, which is the voodoo you've seen on TV. That's the one of curses and things like that. And so allegedly, she created a curse and ended up killing that man. Now, if you notice how she has a different setup, so how this one works, you knock 3 times, you write 3 X's on the tomb, you then kiss it, and within 1 year, whoever you are thinking about is dead. Okay? So that is the idea here. So you can see a lot of people have died. Okay? Now, listen. Here's the other crazy part of this. Okay? Now, they have a rule, especially in St. Louis Cemetery number 1, everybody wants a tomb. And these tombs are very, very hard to come by. And people are on waiting lists their entire lives trying to get a tomb in St. Louis Cemetery number 1. And so how it works is if a tomb is decrepit, which means it's been sitting there a while, nobody has been using it, it's not well kept. If it's not well kept for 50 years, you can then buy that tomb. And so what happens is that some tombs will have these tombs could have, 5, 6 families in it, possibly. And you can also sell your tomb as well if you need the money to it. So what happens is that this is decrepit. Nobody has come to clean it for about 100 years. There is a massive waiting list for all of the tombs. Do you think anybody's ever put an offer in on this one? There's been a few, except they've all fallen through for mysterious reasons. One family, for example, put it in. They paid down the deposit. A couple weeks later, 2 people had already died in their family, and they pulled out their bid. So this is stayed there. It is for sale. It is actually online. It actually says clearance tomb. And it's about $150,000 if you want to purchase it. I wouldn't, though, because, curse. Okay? So let's talk about another famous tomb. So this is actually by a famous celebrity. Yes?
Was only the Queen's daughter in the...
She is the only one that's in there. However, allegedly, they say that they were doing some work on it and they never saw any dust or anything in there. That's what they've said. Allegedly. Okay? So this is actually one that is owned by a famous person. Okay, this famous person built this tomb for $1.2 million. He is not dead yet, and he will be buried there later on. Anybody have any guesses? Had one person guess it. He is from a movie that is definitely a national treasure. Nicolas Cage. Okay, so Nicolas Cage owns this tomb. It can fit 350 bodies in it. His rule is that until he dies, nobody can be buried in it, and then all of his family can be buried into it as well. Okay? So one interesting thing, though, is that in the recession, Nicolas Cage lost everything. He went into bankruptcy and different things like that. Well, the thing is that by law, they cannot take away a plot. So he kept this. It's his wealth was this one thing that he ended up having, that he could keep. Okay? Now, let's pretend that you don't have enough money to be able to pay for one of these tombs. If you have something special about you, you can be part of a societal tomb. So in this case, this is firefighters. So if you're a firefighter, you pay $20 a month, and then when you die, you can be put into this tomb to save your family money. Now, one of these tombs is the Italian societal tomb. How do you think you get into this one? You have to be Italian. 100% Italian, by the way. So you have to be 100% Italian from everybody in your family. So if one person's I want to go marry a Colombian, nope, can't qualify. Okay? Now in this tomb, which by the way is 2 stories tall, each of these drawers all together, this can hold about 3,000 bodies into it. Well, a couple years ago, there was a massive rave that was at the cemetery. It was a big problem that they were having. If you notice, somebody stole the head and also began opening drawers and taking out bodies. Okay? So, in the end, they closed the cemetery and nobody's allowed to go in unless you're on an official tour. Okay? Now, in terms of the Protestants, they did find a way to bury them into the ground, but as you can see, nobody else is buried there. It was very much a racism thing that was there. By the way, this is my tour leader. Her and the other tour leader went in and bought a tomb together, and they're going to be buried together in a tomb. That's how much they love the cemetery. Okay? So, next class, I will start. There's 5 minutes left of this lecture. I will talk to you about it next class period, and we'll actually learn why all this is important. Okay? So you go ahead and get ready to go.